Noriu pristatyti Eglę Murauskaitę, TSPMI dėstytoja. Nuo to pradedu, nors biografijoje kitoje parašyta.
Jūs didžiai, nepasisavinti nuo iš karto.
Iš karto.
So I would like to introduce Eglė Murauskaitė, who is a lecturer at the, kaip jūs vadinatės?
Tarptautinių santykių ir politikos mokslo institutas.
Institute of International Relations and Political Science at the Vilnius University.
Saugumo specialistė.
A specialist in security.
Vyriausia specialistė ir vyriausia mokslininkė, skirtingai mačiau, Merilendo universitete. Vyriausia mokslininkė.
Senior scholar at the University of Maryland.
Ir šiuo metu dirba simuliacijų dizainerė. Karo ir saugumo temomis.
And presently working as a simulations designer in the fields of war and security.
Ir viskas, eterą nebeužimu ir žodis tau.
So thank you very much to Jogilė for the introduction. And thank you to Antanas and the foundation for the invite to speak here. It's a true pleasure to connect with such a diverse audience. And I've been asked to share some insights about European identity and identity in general from the perspective of security, the field that I've been working at for the past 15 years or so. So with that in mind, I'll try to talk and share some thoughts about geopolitical shifts in the face of identity crisis and some of the drivers of these phenomena that I teach and study on. So to start, it might not be a bad idea to reflect back on something that a Lithuanian artist, Darius Žiūra, has put quite nicely, that with plant, insects, and bacteria, as well as minerals recognized as having distinct identities, post-humanism is like a pagan shaman swirling up every living being in an ecstatic dance against the backdrop of a looming war. So I think it's quite a profound sort of reminder to whom do we assign identities, and that the dance is worth engaging in despite the circumstances that might be changing, might be unstable, might make us feel insecure at some point. So let us get started, right? Probably no one will be surprised to hear that over the past several decades, democracies are increasingly less willing to propose a constructive agenda, whereas the 90s, as we have heard from Ms. Hannah, were really a time of the collapse of the Iron Wall, massive idealism, the promise of democracy, the US seen, although not necessarily owning this vision as the chief flag post for this ideological concept. Increasingly, we see less and less willingness to bear that flag, to carry the message, to be the lighthouse. The 30 years or so of various levels of democratic experiences have led to not only external criticism increasing, but also very much and prominently so internal reflections by prominent democracies in Europe, across the Atlantic and elsewhere on, very sort of self-conscious understanding of the limits of what a democracy can and cannot do. So again, the wild 90s, the prospects and idealism, where we think about, economies of scale, new markets, competition, not the 60s so much of make love and not war, but make trade and not war. Unsurprisingly, that didn't quite work out either. So right now, if we think still of attempts of Europe, America, various international organizations to talk to countries about why it's worth trying to engage in democratization, trying to do reforms, talking about open market appeals, a little bit more careful there. No one quite as eager to open up, and also the prospective candidates not so enthused, seeing how difficult it is actually to compete. The very clear evidence to see how slow political processes and institutional reforms are, how frustrating it is, how many generational, not even mental, but very physical generational shifts need to take place, and yet the result is less than overly joyful. The quality of life has been quite clearly disassociated from the political status of a country, say quite a few millionaires and billionaires in China and Saudi Arabia, democracy doing not so well there. On the other hand, income inequality in the US being perhaps among the highest. So really a very clear identity and ideological separation, increasingly less obvious, right? So in the face of this realistic cold shower, it is increasingly difficult to see anyone, not the United States specifically, but anyone at all, willing to make the sales pitch, right? Inside the US, we see quite a bit of turmoil, and with the election coming up yet again, I probably need not remind anyone of that. But it is interesting that a recent study of 2023 by Danish scholars of US surveys of specific US demographic segments have shown that, in particular, young men, both white and of color, are basically externalizing their disappointment and hatred, actually, for the elite. They're externalizing it to the hatred towards the system in general. And there is this very prominent spirit expressed in just like total disappointment and desire for complete destruction. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see, while many of us are still debating, okay, so there's the rise of extremism, there's terrorism, there's radical right, there is, disinformation and all that. There's actually a growing segment of people in very rich and arguably democratic environments that just wish to see not an exchange of A for Z, but an exchange for A for null, for nothing, complete destruction. And there is no overarching vision currently on that domestic, individual level, as well as on international level, for reasons I've just discussed. So democratic vision is, the lighthouse is kind of getting extinguished slowly. And not very many outsiders or external causes to point a finger to, right? However, the universe hates a vacuum, and unsurprisingly, China is quite successfully trying to fill it. In contrast to the Cold War, when there was a huge priority on engaging external parties, forming alliances, actively vying to increase one's influence in the global sphere, not so much right now. And actually, failure to engage with the global South has been seen as one of the many failures of the West in general, even when you come to conflicts, right? The war in Ukraine, failure to sell it to the global South has had some serious circumstances. In studies I have seen statistically, percentage-wise, during the first year of war, so basically between 2022 and 2023, every single country that has seen a drop of the share of the population that supports Ukraine versus Russia. So in the global South, these are the consequences. And this is no small potatoes. I mean, countries like India, countries like Australia, the entire Latin America, right? These are seriously sizable populations, and though they may not be, part of G20 or G7, they are active through other mechanisms, and they are to be counted. So on the one hand, while we might see this visionary retreat as perhaps another iteration of, mea culpa over white man's burden, right? Like, well, we've been trying to sell you democracy. Sorry, overstepped the boundaries there a little bit. But there's also a very dark side where you're still trying to act out on these democratic beliefs in a conflict, saying, this is the last ditch of democracy versus authoritarianism, and you're not engaging, you're retreating. And the consequences are rather dangerous, right? Before, Russia used to be a huge worry. I try to underemphasize it, actually, when I talk to the Baltic audiences, simply because I think if there is ever a beacon of anti-Russia sentiment in Europe or in the world, like right there. So probably why preach to the choir? On the other hand, much of the rest of the world is really focused on the China threat, which is still relatively underappreciated here. So thus the emphasis in the points that I usually make. So European security, right? The war in Ukraine, the conflict that had started in 2014 as a gray zone form of warfare has been perhaps the first of the wake-up call. Then, of course, we've had the Trump presidency that truly shook the grounds that European and democratic identity stands on. And the continuation, perhaps a speed up of American isolationism and retreat. The global, not just European, rise of the radical right, serious problems that, again, the identity and democracy are still grappling with. And then Ukraine 2022, bringing all of that in a nice little bouquet that keeps us sneezing still. There seems to be a growing recognition when talking about security and priorities about the need in Europe to rebuild conventional forces. The Trump presidency, I believe, was a very clear sort of reminder how Europe had for many decades outsourced its hard security in exchange for economic development, social welfare, etc. And understanding that all of a sudden we're there with a rather limited military-industrial complex, very limited production capacity, again, problems that have come to truly bite since 2022. However, this is where our identity as a democracy and market competition is not so helpful. Not that I would like to stand here and advocate authoritarianism instead, but when people in Europe keep saying we need to step up our defenses and talk about the gap to be filled in production capacity, well, I should very much like to see the country to volunteer to host the entire production of, say, tanks for Europe or airplanes or even airplane engines. In terms of the pressure that they would immediately come up against from the entire bloc. I mean, what a lucrative contract, right? Because in NATO, we like unified standards, and it makes sense to coordinate our defense procurements and our army trainings. But then whom do we trust to be the sole provider, right? If any particular government could muster up the necessary investments and political commitment that we're going to do this, and we're talking like 50+ year time horizons, the market competition is like, we don't want you to have all of that pie. And so since 2014, since 22, the needle hasn't budged very much in that department. That's why I personally remain rather pessimistic and skeptical about European future in terms of hard security. I don't really see how this particular problem could be overcome. Even on a smaller scale, in the Baltic states, I've been personally harping on about how we're failing to coordinate defense procurements throughout the Baltics plus Poland for the exact same reason, because of market competition and business pressures, not even the economies of scale. So to imagine, the entire bloc with quite a diverse membership overcoming this, yeah, good luck. This is related to the other problem in Europe that while, in the 90s and the post-Second World War, everyone seemed to be quite happy to, attempt convergence of certain kind up to a certain point. Again, there is sufficient anxiety right now about the rise of any particular pillar of power. So be it the United Kingdom gaining too much vis-a-vis Germany or France, be it Germany, raising its head again with all the full spectrum of its political challenges, and its identity has actually shifted quite a bit with the immigration accommodation over the past 30 years or so, right? So, whereas in the Defense Department, we see it very pragmatically, we see it very hard when we're thinking about more conceptually, right? Political, economic development, European leadership, the struggle is real, yet again, right? So after quite a long period of convergence, the gradual counterwave of divergence perhaps shouldn't come as such a big of a surprise. At the same time, while we're talking about, this hard security challenge, which are essentially a low probability, but a very high impact event, so, keeps our eyes and ears peeled during the news, we have been facing various hybrid threats and threats below the threshold of war on a regular basis, and increasingly so. Indeed, me and my colleagues have done a book about that, how the US, China, and Russia use gray zone warfare in different forms, and we go through economic, legal, and military aspects of it. And yet, there has been a pretty limited recognition of how to actually adapt to this broader security concept. Because ask anybody, security, okay, percentage to the GDP. Okay, next best case, volunteering for the armed forces. How do we show that we really are serious about protecting our country, have a backpack ready, and sign up to the Rifleman Union? Well, how is that going to help you with the big problems that are here already? Not with a probability, but with a certainty. Increasing inequality and increasing gaps between different members and individuals of society. Increasing fracturing, indeed, of the social fabric across many forms, be it racial hatred, be it migrant crises at the border of Lithuania as well as many other countries, be it difficulties of urban versus rural split and changing appreciation of the rural livelihoods and the levels of depression and economic opportunities as well as education and healthcare opportunities in faraway distant areas of the country. Very real consequences there in terms of how people vote in the election, very real impact on how willing these people would be to defend the country should the low probability event happen. And very real steps that could be taken daily to make a change, but somehow the security calculus doesn't add up, right? It's not a very popular decision to increase taxes or to encourage people to be more welcoming to others of various types, of different sexual orientation, gender, race, religion. So in terms of this identity and security, while in Lithuania there still seems to be quite a big drumbeat about countering the Russia threat, and there is definitely value added in a small country being such a European level beacon for a particular issue. In my personal opinion, because we have to distinguish clearly opinions from facts, so it's not a fact, but this is how I look at it. If you consider the traditional economic utility function of, effort contributed versus results, I would say that Lithuania is probably quite close to capacity in terms of hard security. Any additional security that we would generate for ourselves, if you want to talk hard security, that would come from a shared European effort. I mean, we can finance only so many tanks and planes, and we're only so big. But somehow this is still the drum we're choosing to beat. On the other hand, very realistically, social cohesion and soft security, the threats that we're facing, our potential to counter that preventively, to shut the spaces that have been opened for it, is practically limitless, except that we don't choose to view these identity politics as a security issue, and thus somehow it seems, come election time or come popular points gathering time on social media, definitely much more popular to show, wave your flag and show your gun than to be seen, in a pride parade, for example, or at the border among freezing migrants for some reason. We have to also remember in all of this that nation states and national identities are still a relatively recent concept. I mean, while Lithuania in particular likes to be very proud of the Grand Duchy, that wasn't a nation state. Being a Lithuanian wasn't so much a thing back in the day, right? Separation of religion and state, or the judiciary and state, and the external accountability, perhaps through the media, through the publicity, all very recent concepts. And yet, in the face of insecurity, the choice to sort of grasp on the national identity straw, paradoxically, quite often just exacerbates the insecurity through othering. Because when you're forming the national identity through this toughness, the winning mentality, the achiever mentality, the number one, the defender, the able one, well, guess what? Increasing numbers of people are left out because they cannot keep up. When is it going to be a good idea to be joined by vulnerability? And I'm not talking sharing depression stories on Facebook, but more the willingness to openly embrace our own limitations and step away from the sort of all-knowing certainty when it comes to answers to difficult questions. Because the conference is in Lithuania, and I'm talking in English, I wanted to share as a little interlude in this already extensive talk, a little poem by Aidas Marčėnas, which I have translated, but for the benefit of Lithuanians, I'll go through it in Lithuanian first, because I think it's such an excellent reflection on this identity issue. So, mėnulyje niekas negyvena, po nakties pailsėt atsigulęs, atsakys jums mėnulio dievulis. Ak, lietuviai, jūs mano lietuviai, tik mėnulyje jums ir vieta. Kas tėvynę nuo jūsų apgynė? So in English, it goes more or less, ends the night, the moon may rest, looking over from his crest. Oh, wherever shall they stand, Lithuanians, bless. Who'll defend the land from them? To the moon might they be sent. So essentially, it's quite interesting how this overemphasis on national identity really sometimes makes the us versus them divide so that you might forget what it is that you're fighting for and become a threat to your neighbor, to those vulnerable populations, to people in need who would perhaps very gladly contribute to something constructive and long-term were they given a chance. On the other hand, because everything is in every which way and certainty is way overrated, there is a very interesting study, probably almost 10 years ago now, done in the US again, and it talks about something called the yuck factor. It tries to explain the biological propensity for conservatism. And I think it's, also while I'm here bashing the nationalism essentially and the overratedness of identities, well, some of us are more strongly biologically inclined to cling to that. Again, good reason to be forgiving and understanding rather than condemnatory. So what the study has shown is that in testing people's reaction to disgust, they show that some people are biologically much more inclined to express and experience disgust much more strongly. So showing them, pictures of rotting flesh, of smelly socks, and disfigured faces, and torn limbs from war zones has a much stronger impact on certain types of people than others. And because it was a very interesting interdisciplinary study, the reason why they pulled this out is that this propensity for disgust was directly correlated to people's voting patterns. Something you would not necessarily expect, right? So people who tend to experience disgust more strongly are more inclined to vote Republican in the US, or generally be more conservative. So could be, more religiously leaning, or other forms, not necessarily political expressions of conservatism, but thus it is. And so what the scholars did is they looked at the biological and neural impulses, the consistencies of people's tongues, and the relation to the brain, how those impulses travel. And to cut the long story short there, so, back in the ancestral days of Homo erectus and the different mixings of species, when there was a very good chance that a stranger you encounter might carry bacteria that you would die from, essentially, has made certain people much more cautious about, well, obviously touching that stranger or eating strange food that you haven't seen before, right? Some of us are naturally more inclined, what's this mushroom, what's this berry, whatever. Others are like, my mother used to cook this is what I'm eating, bye-bye. So there is a good biological explanation for that, right? Like, this is how deep it goes. This deeply, deeply ingrained reptile brain inclination to protect yourself, so as not to die from an encounter with the other, to this day might translate towards more conservative views and more exclusionary behavior towards these are one of us, racially, sexually, linguistically, and these people, please go away, right? We don't feel so secure there. So like anyone who has ever tried to, rise above through meditation or in general take a more detached view in life, observing any phenomena, being able to step outside, from an emotion, from an argument, from a belief, the very act of observation is already quite empowering. Well, you're inclined to do this, to say this, to behave this way. Is this what you really want? Maybe it is, who knows, right? But when you consider this, it's a very good idea to just be a little bit careful. On the one hand, condemning people for why they're holding on to supranationalist conservative views and why this identity is so important to them, to the exclusion of so much potential that really could be gained. On the other hand, if you happen to be one of those people, might be a good idea to reflect a little bit, right? One question that I think is definitely worth asking in the context of security in Lithuania, in Europe, whatever threat or opponent you imagine you might be facing, When is there enough? Following the acts of terrorism, we have seen the massive introduction of airport security, which greatly increases the time needed to get from point A to point B, naturally increases the expense as well, right? With the people employed, if you value your time as well, transportation needed. But you understand that it's not 100%. So how much of intrusiveness are you willing to accept, right? Is a scan okay? Is an x-ray okay? Is a bodily pad okay? Is like invasive check of bodily cavities okay? When is there enough security? On this micro scale example. If you're thinking about Lithuania and its permanent geographical lodging in the shadow of Russia, when is there enough security? When there's no longer Putin, well, there is a huge establishment, as we know, that takes decades and decades to change in terms of mindset. When Russia is fractured, well, fracturing states are a beacon of instability regionally and globally. When there's nothing but the desert there, like when are we satisfied? When is there enough security? We cannot have anything 100%. And as I've just talked in the beginning, mustering physical defenses is quite difficult. Shifting your mindset towards how you approach the threat as well as how you gather the alliance, and I'm talking nationally, strengthening community cohesion, that's quite a different undertaking. Right? So when we're hearing people, let's invest in defense, let's increase defense spending, let's shore up European defenses, let's convince our European/NATO partners to have more presence on this country, when is there enough? I'm not saying that these steps are not necessary. I'm just inviting the question, is there ever a point where we would be happy in this domain? And if not, what is the price that you're still willing to pay? Where do you draw the line, right? Because hard security comes typically at the expense of economic and social welfare. And if we can all agree that the threats that we realistically face every day are not hard but are soft security threats, then you understand that by increasing the defense budget, you're taking away from the budgets that could do preventive work over there, right? How do we balance that scale? It's quite nice to prepare to be a hero, right? To imagine how a monument would be erected to you because you did something spectacular. But a community is not built on spectacular acts. Community is built on simple, boring, everyday routines that make an increasing amount of people willing to be vulnerable, willing to remove their personal defenses, and perhaps dare to share something from the inside that wasn't safe before. Quite a different calculus, right? What it takes to create such an environment. If we're looking at Ukraine, for example, which we will do in a moment, national identity has always been seen as one of the critical factors that made its defense so successful. But deeper studies actually show that it's not so much national identity as social cohesion. When you ask explicit questions about why these people were willing to endure bombings, why these people were willing to share their clothes and shelter with soldiers, to allow soldiers to station weapons in their houses, which made them targets for Russian artillery, it's social cohesion. In fact, Ukraine, which is on a polity scale not such a democratic country as perhaps we would like. A polity scale is a global country rating where -10 basically means you're an autocracy, +10 means you're an exemplary democracy. Ukraine is at +4. That should give us a slight pause, right? How we look at, say, migrants from countries of war in the Middle East, a lot of them share that ranking. Not the religion, not the color of the skin, but if we're there for humanitarianism, if we're acting out from the Christian democratic principles that we pronounce here, well, how does that sit, right? Quite a famous historical study of Erica Chenoweth has shown that over a period of time that spans 100 years, basically, from the 1900s to 2006, the most successful forms of resistance have been nonviolent resistance. So people like Martin Luther King, Gandhi, could be examples that we may like or dislike, but historically, if you look at any type of resistance movement to foreign occupation, in a movement in the Civil War, any kind of movement really, they have been tremendously more successful than violent resistance. Again, the explanation is that more people can join because the entry bar is so much lower. I mean, hands up how many would like to die this afternoon for a good cause. I mean, the cause might truly be good, but like really, right now? Whereas, well, how would you like to donate money? Well, perhaps more hands. How would you like to work for that cause? Perhaps contributing a day, a month, or I don't know, a week, a year. Maybe more hands, right? So making activity, nation and community building activity accessible to growing number of differently abled and differently endowed and inclined people, actually historically, over the past century, most successful thing ever. And also an undersold story. I mean, in Lithuania and many other countries, we again, it's very easy to glorify people and build a monument for someone who shot a bad guy, who saved a good guy, who was there a hero for a day. Not so helpful in the long term, unfortunately. Ego boosting, surely. Nation building, depends how the political wind blows. So finalizing some thoughts on Ukraine again, and also shameless self-promotion, I did a book on the first war in Ukraine that came out at the end of this July, assessing different methods that worked and didn't work there, and also a study that I'm currently finalizing deals specifically with resilience and nonviolent resistance and examples there. So some of the interesting parallels that might be worth also considering and discussing further is the dark side of comprehensive defense and broad social involvement and political involvement in these challenges. So for example, a story that might be very familiar to, say, the French, the Germans, and Lithuanians as well, that of people who collaborate during the war with the occupying regime. And in fact, several international organizations have heavily criticized Ukraine for this practice as running against the principles of human rights protection. The United Nations study has shown that during the war, almost 11,000 people in Ukraine between 2022 and today have been captured and brought to legal accountability on the basis that they're a suspected collaborator. And in many, many of those cases, international human rights activists were showing that these people were under active duress of the occupying regime and had very little choice there. How is that for democratic identity and value defense, right? Difficult situations justify different measures, but then what are we fighting for? Another interesting piece from again, the darker ledgers of this war, vulnerability and sexual crimes. I did a recent study on the role of women in Russia's war against Ukraine, and it was quite, it gave me quite a pause to see how many women from Russia chose to participate in sexual crimes. So basically conduct rape of Ukrainian women as well as men. Not that Russians or Russian women are somehow distinct in this. Turns out it's a global phenomenon, historically quite common. But then another thing came out, the notion of vulnerability and how it is changing in this war. That typically women and children are considered automatically to be the vulnerable populace in pretty much any war. And in fact, Ukrainian women constitute the absolute majority of those emigrating, so that means mostly the people who are staying are men. However, Human Rights Watch statistics show that actually 2023 and 2024, Ukrainian men are predominantly the victims of sexual crimes. How interesting is that, right? And it's a truly shameful notion, so there are basically no legal tools and very little language available to present Ukrainian men as a vulnerable populace. Least of all in the eyes of Russian soldiers, to whom every man, civilian or not, is a potential fighter, right? And again, we hear stories about the, valorous acts of Ukrainian women and identity and national belief in the national idea, calling them to do acts that sometimes seem superhumane. How do we treat the notions of vulnerability in contexts like these? How do we create a space for men to be vulnerable, to be recognized as vulnerable? Not in a sense, put down your weapons and don't resist, but how do we deal with the new notions in the war and the new wounds of society that it reveals? For the very end, I'd like to share some statistics from the same study that I'm finalizing now. So there was an interesting survey, again, similar to the mental exercise I just did. So there was an actual survey in Ukraine. In 2022, January, right before the war, a representative sample of the population was asked, how would you like to contribute should the war worsen, right? Because we remember since 2014, the country has been in quite a difficult situation. 25% say we would like to offer non-military support. So clothes, money, things like that. 18% say, well, we're just gonna worry about survival, whatever it takes. Emigration was a choice 3% of people would make. Well, not even a couple of months later, we can see how the cards shook out. So up to 2024, 16% of the Ukrainian population has actually emigrated. On the other hand, the non-military assistance is provided actively by more than 70% of the population, right? Again, a massively, massively underused asset. In the same survey, quite unsurprisingly, when asked how many would like to resist militarily, be it as part of the Ukrainian armed forces or as some sort of, military unit, individual volunteering, the numbers tend to fluctuate between 7 and 9%, and during the first 2 years of the war, the actual numbers corresponded pretty well with it. When I was looking at global statistics, in case of an armed conflict, the share of the population taking part in armed resistance or fighting in the armed forces, pretty similar. And look at the effort we're expending, trying to mobilize, to convince more people to take up arms. Very, very hard push. Result? Minor change. Whereas, again, non-military resistance, a huge and expanding spectrum of options, 70% of the population, 3/4, without any big push. What a huge and underutilized potential to pick up on today.
Man vėl lietuviškai. Man taip lengviau būtų, angliškai pradėti kalbėti. Bet lietuviškai, taip?
Okay, maybe let's try in English and have a Lithuanian translation. What do you think?
Gerai, taip? So thank you for your interesting talk. When I was listening to you, I was thinking that those apartment blocks renovation programs are the best ways to build community, because community is not necessarily soft and cute and a nice thing. It's difficult to build a community.
Ačiū už įdomų pranešimą. Aš klausydamasi pagalvojau, kad daugiabučių renovacija yra geras būdas kurti bendruomenę, todėl kad bendruomenė nebūtinai yra kažkas ten mielo ir pūkuoto, bet yra kaip tik sunkus ir sudėtingi procesai ir užmezga ryšius.
Tai norėčiau užduoti pirmą tokį klausimą. Too many languages. So I want to start with that question of ontological security or existential threat, or whatever, existential anxiety, which other concept you like more. But how communities can deal with that? Because that's always there, right? Dealing with it is a process, and some of the ways are more productive, as you were saying, and others are less productive. So what kind of ways do you see to deal with those existential, overwhelming threats?
Tai aš norėčiau pradėti nuo klausimo apie ontologinės arba egzistencinės grėsmes, kurios, jos neišsprendžiamos, jos neišnyksta, su jomis dorotis yra procesas. Tai norėjau paklausti, kokius tu matai būdus bendruomenėms, tą ištverti ir su tuo tvarkytis.
An excellent question, and as complex as the process is lengthy.
Puikus klausimas ir procesas yra tikrai ilgas.
I think the first part to begin to answer it is the way we define security and threats.
Manau, pradėti atsakinėti į klausimą reikia nuo to, kaip apibrėšim saugumą ir grėsmę.
In my opinion, over the past, if not 20, then 50 years, the whole discourse in general in society has been overly securitized.
Mano nuomonė pastarosius, jeigu ne 20, tai 15 metų.
50.
50. Visuomenėje apskritai tas diskursas apie saugumą yra per daug patrauktas į saugumo pusę, nesubalansuotas.
The discourse on anything is using the language of security. This is what I mean by securitization. You're fighting drugs, you're fighting corruption, you're fighting immigration. Basically, everything is a constant fight, an active struggle.
Diskursas bet kokiu klausimu vartoja tą tokį karišką žodyną. Reikia kovoti ir su narkotikais, ir kovoti su korupcija, ir kovoti su imigracija. Beveik bet kokiu klausimu visą laiką nuolatinė kova.
You're also fighting suicides and cancer. You're fighting income inequality. You're fighting racism.
Taip pat kovojama su savižudybėmis, kovojama su vėžiu ir kovojama su rasizmu.
And in some cases, we're already starting to see a shift in the language. Some becomes preventive. Something becomes integrative. Something becomes anticipatory. Something becomes deterrent.
Ir pastaruoju metu pradeda ryškėti permainos kalboje, nes kartais kalbama ir apie prevenciją, ir kartais kalbama apie užbėgimą už akių, kartais kalbama apie atgrasimą ir panašiai.
But still the whole principle that there is inside me as an individual, inside a community or inside a state, some kind of core entity, the I, the we, that must extend spikes like a hedgehog against this unknowable other is very prevalent.
Bet vis tiek vis dar labai gajus, tokia nuostata ar laikysena, kad yra kažkoks toksai kertinis aš arba mes, kuris turi kaip ežys atkišti spyglius kokiam nors kitam.
So I think the more we understand that otherness is not a threat, that even if integration is uncomfortable, it doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, if we're talking about democracy, it is uncomfortable. It is naturally dissatisfying, but for some reason we agree to bear it. So then conceptually, why not extend it further?
Ir aš manau, kad labai svarbu mažinti tą jausmą, kad kitoniškumas būtinai yra grėsmė, nes, pavyzdžiui, demokratija yra nepatogi, yra nemaloni, bet tai nereiškia, kad su ja kas nors blogai. Ir tokią logiką galima pratęsti ar perkelti į kitas sritis taip pat.
So I think we're stuck between two extremes. On the one hand, we would think, okay, there is utter satisfaction, complete fulfillment of all the needs. You're rich, you're fed, you're spiritually happy, you have a soulmate, your job is fulfilling, everything's amazing, you're permanently young.
Ir aš manau, kad mes įstringam tarp dviejų kraštutinumų, kur viename viskas yra gerai, esi turtingas, sotus, dvasiškai laimingas, visapusiškai viskuo aprūpintas ir visada, nuolatos viskas gerai, nuolatos patenkintas.
And on the other hand, we have this creeping Christian guilt of, the rich will not make it to the kingdom of heaven. You must be humble. You must self-flagellate. I'm successful, but I have suffered, so maybe I deserve it. So there is also that kind of victim mentality that somehow being a victim and suffering is a great thing too.
Ir kita vertus yra tokia iš pasalų prisėlinanti krikščioniška kaltė, kuris sako, kad jeigu patiriu kančias, tai galbūt to nusipelniau, ir kartu išlieka tas toksai aukos sureikšminimas, kad kančios savaime yra kažkokia vertybė.
So then to get back to the question and to the point, so how can we feel more balanced and more secure? That means taking a big step back from either of those extremities and being comfortable in the discomfort and uncertainty, recognizing that I will not always be suffering, but probably I will not always be comfortable, and a lot of the time I will not know. And so what?
Ir grįžtant prie klausimo, kaip įveikti tas egzistencinės, ar kaip ištverti tas egzistencinės grėsmės, tai turbūt ir yra svarbu ištverti tą nepatogumo būseną, kad aš turbūt ne visada kentėsiu ir patirsiu kančias, bet ne visada būsiu viskuo patenkintas ir net ne visada suprasiu ar žinosiu.
So, being a political scientist, I really want to come back to the concepts and definitions, because when I listen to you, I constantly think, is it actually the same? Individual security and anxiety, anxiety and security of community and of nation state? Because the way you speak, it seems that these are all so interrelated that they refer to the same phenomena. But do they actually are the same? Are they the same?
Aš kaip politologė vis tiek norėčiau grįžti prie apibrėžimų, nes klausydamasi pranešimo vis galvojau apie tai, kad tu kalbi apie individo nerimą ir saugumą, ir bendruomenės nerimą ir saugumą, ir net tautinės valstybės saugumą ir nerimą. Taip, tarsi tai būtų tas pats, bet ar tai tikrai yra tas pats dalykas?
It's a question definitely worth dissecting. So first of all, there's a very different psychological dynamic between an individual and group, and let's say an individual layperson versus a public leader or anyone in a public position.
Klausimą tikrai reikia patyrinėti, nes be abejo, kad yra skirtumų netgi tarp individų ir, pavyzdžiui, tarp eilinio piliečio ir viešo politinio lyderio saugumo jausmo.
To be more precise, I believe that the security is the same, and a lot of the issues that cause individual insecurity, they create a space for certain political phenomena to unfold and form very specific political directions.
Konkrečiau kalbant, aš manau, kad saugumas yra tas pats ir situacijos, kuriuose kyla nerimas dėl saugumo, sukuria tam tikrą erdvę politiniams reiškiniams ir politinėms kryptims rinktis.
So individuals who have low levels of life satisfaction are less inclined to support communities that they live in, very unsurprisingly.
Tai nestebina tai, kad žmonės, kurių pasitenkinimas savo gyvenimu yra menkas, jie daug mažiau linkę remti bendruomenės, kurioms priklauso.
And when someone is experiencing low-level life satisfaction, they're quite prone to any quick fix promises, because if the suffering is prominent, you would be more inclined to look for immediate alleviation.
Ir kai žmogus yra menkai patenkintas savo gyvenimu, jis yra labiau linkęs prie tokių greitų, skubotų sprendimų. Nes jeigu kančia yra tiesiogiai patiriama, tai tada ir išeities norisi greitos.
So in terms, this creates a very fruitful space for populist politics, for short-term political solutions, for all types of extremist organizations, and it might just depend on our ideological spectrum, whether we agree with it or not. Someone fundamentally dissatisfied with where the world is going and the global decline of capitalist values, if they choose to take up arms to support Ukraine as the last bastion of democracy, we might cheer them on. If they choose instead to join ISIS, we might have something else to say about that. However, the drivers are not so different.
Ir taip atsiranda labai vaisinga erdvė visokiam populizmams ir kraštutinumams ir panašiems reiškiniams. Ir tai, kaip mes tai vertinam, gali priklausyti nuo mūsų pačių ideologijos. Nes jeigu, pavyzdžiui, žmogus taip iš esmės nepatenkintas tuo, kur ritasi pasaulis, nusprendžia remti Ukrainą, kaip paskutinį čia bastioną, tai tada mes tam pritarsime ir to džiaugsimės, bet jeigu žmogus dėl tokių pačių paskatų įstoja į ISIS, tai tada mes tai smerksim.
So while again, what I started at, it's a very different psychological phenomena and also socio-political phenomena in terms of how group psychology and group dynamics impact decisions both in a community level and political level, and also very different phenomena how anybody, any lay person acts in public space. Visibility, definitely the act of observation adds to the change.
Taigi yra labai skirtingi reiškiniai, kaip veikia grupių psichologija ir bendruomenių psichologija ir kaip veikia kiekvienas iš mūsų individualiam lygmenį.
The publicity factor being key. But the point is that you could say through this mechanism that I've just described that someone having no access to education, limited life prospects, shitty healthcare, unfulfilling job, failing to find a secure and form secure attachment romantically or socially, very directly that contributes to the rise of extreme right and global insecurity. Very directly that contributes to very divisive politics. So it is the same concept, even though the ways how this influence is channeled from individual to state is nuanced.
Ir jeigu žmogus yra nepatenkintas gyvenimu, bet taip pat negauna išsilavinimo, neturi jokių galimybių, jaučiasi nerealizavę savęs ir taip toliau, tai labai tiesiogiai prisideda prie kraštutinės dešinės augimo visam pasauliui, nors yra niuansuota ar subtilu tai, kaip yra pereinama nuo to individualaus lygio į politinį ir valstybinį.
I have another question starting with Germany. I was looking into the results of AfD recently in those Sachsen and Thuringia. And one of the explanations why they are succeeding is that they have issues there with school system.
Aš neseniai žiūrėjau į AfD rezultatus Vokietijos, Saksonijoje ir Thuringijoje, taip. Ir viena iš priežasčių, kodėl AfD, čia Alternative für Deutschland, kodėl jiems ten gerai sekasi, yra tai, kad jie tose žemėse yra problemų mokyklose, mokyklų sistemoje.
They have, as I understand, rather similar issues as we have in Lithuania, that there's lack of teachers, lack of schools, level of schools is low, and etc., etc.
Kiek suprantu, tos problemos truputį panašios kaip Lietuvoje.
Labai panašios.
Labai panašios kaip Lietuvoje. Yra trūksta mokytojų ir trūksta mokyklų ir esamų mokyklų žemas lygis ir panašiai.
So at that point I started thinking, what if we approach the issues that we consider to be national as international problems, and maybe that could help us to solve that internal insecurity, saying, that there's something wrong about us, or we did it to ourselves, but that it's like processes that are taking place globally. What do you think about that?
Ir tada pagalvojau, o jeigu mes į tas problemas, kurias laikom savo nacionaliniam, pažiūrėtumėm kaip į tarptautinės. Ir nes mes galvojam, kad mes čia patys kalti arba patys prisidirbam, nors iš tikrųjų tai yra pasaulinio proceso dalis.
Well, Europe has in fact been taking this precise approach for the past 30 years. It is Lithuania specifically that refuses to do so.
Europa kaip tik taip maždaug ir žiūri pastarosius 30 metų, tik tai Lietuva nesutinka prie to prisidėti.
If you were to consider typical annual surveys of European decision makers and their listings of the top threats they see their country is facing.
Jeigu pasižiūrėtumėm į kasmetinės apklausas politinių lyderių, kur jų prašoma išvardinti 3 svarbiausias grėsmės kylančias jų šaliai.
Countries like Germany, France, Spain, in fact, much of Central and Southern Europe consistently name economic inequality and migration among the top threats. Hard security is definitely not a priority, and country examples, be it China or Russia, never make the top 10.
Tokios šalis kaip Vokietija, Prancūzija, Ispanija ir apskritai didžioji dalis Vidurio ir Vakarų Europos dažniausiai įvardyja ekonominę nelygybę ir tie tokie kietojo saugumo klausimai ir jo labiau konkrečios šalis kaip Rusija arba Kinija niekada neatsiranda dažniausiai minimų grėsmių dešimtukuose.
So it should point to how other countries with longer democratic experience, with more integrative experience, have been taking this approach, seeing global phenomena reflected in their socio-political processes and recognize that as a threat. So not just military threats, but inequality, migration, healthcare being seen as a threat, whereas Lithuania has a particularly narrow approach in this case.
Taigi tai rodo, kaip šalis su stipresnė demokratija, kaip tik tai ir daro, kad žiūri į tokius pasaulinius reiškinius ir juos laiko grėsmėmis savo šaliai, o Lietuvoje tas saugumo klausimas yra suprantamas labai siaurai.
And in the same surveys then, when you consider coalition-making potential, that is countries that you would like to be in a coalition with and questions that you could jointly work on, Lithuania, unsurprisingly thus, finds it quite hard to form coalitions, because when you refuse to prioritize partner priorities, you're left alone.
Ir tose pačiose apklausose, kai yra klausima apie koalicijų galimybės, tai yra su kokiomis šalimis norėtumėt ar galėtumėt sudaryti koaliciją, Lietuva dažnai lieka labai viena, todėl kad jinai nesuteikia pirmenybės arba nesuteikia reikšmės savo partnerių prioritetams ir todėl tų partnerių rasti sunku.
So when we're facing traditional state-level threats, traditional institutions that Lithuania since the 90s has joined does offer quite a bit of relief. However, the problem is that the smaller threats that we're increasingly faced with that are mutating and globally present a global challenge, that's where we fall off the bandwagon.
Ir įvairios institucijos, prie kurių Lietuva yra prisijungusi, jau ir taip labai palengvina tas, tokios siaura prasme suprantamos saugumo grėsmės, bet tos smulkesnės problemos kinta ar mutuoja ir va čia Lietuva atsilieka nuo kitų.
What you're saying speaks really well to what we were discussing last year, because we were saying that we do not know enough about other countries and traumas of other countries and threats of other countries. So I see a continuous line of discussion here.
Tai labai primena tai, apie ką čia kalbėjom pernai, kad nepakankamai pažįstam kitas šalis ir nežinom vieni kitų traumų ir grėsmių. Tai čia labai susišaukia.
Bet dabar norėčiau duoti galimybę jums paklausti visų savo rūpimų klausimų.
Sigita Barniškienė, norėjau jūsų paklausti, kaip jūs vertinat saugumo situaciją Amerikoje dabartinė, nes mes vis girdim ten visokių susišaudimų ir tai nesiliauja niekada. Ir aišku, Europoje turbūt didžiausia problema tai yra migracija iš tokių šalių kaip Afganistanas, Sirija ir kitos islamo šalis. Kaip jūs į tai žiūrite?
I would like to ask your opinion about security in the United States, because we hear a lot about shootings there, and there seems to be no end to them. And also in Europe, the main threat of security is often perceived to be immigration from countries like Afghanistan or Syria, or in other words, Islamic countries.
Well, it's interesting that you pose the question in that way, as if my opinion or anyone's opinion would have a pronounced impact on that security situation.
Įdomu, kad formuluojate klausimą taip lyg mano ar bet kieno kito nuomonė turėtų kokios nors įtakos tai saugumo padėčiai.
When I was living in the US between 2011 and 2015, walking to work in Washington, I would regularly find bullet shell casings on the grass, and stabbings and shootings in broad daylight in the neighborhood were not uncommon.
Aš gyvenau Amerikoje nuo 2011 iki 2015 ir Vašingtone einant į darbą dažnai rasdavau žolėje šovinių tūtų ir visokie smurtas, užpuolimai su šaltais ginklais. Net ir vidury baltos dienos nebuvo negirdėtas dalykas.
It's quite common and it has been common, but it is not so much a matter of opinion. It is a good reason to look at the causes. And what I've been talking about in my little seminar here, the social divisions, inequality, low level of life satisfaction, the desire to see a complete destruction of any structures, are the root causes that lead to this, but there's very limited willingness to do something about it.
Ir čia svarbu ne tiek nuomonės apie visą tą išplitusią smurtą, kiek tai, kad tai galbūt yra priežastis dingstis patyrinėti priežastis. Ir čia, kaip ir kalbėjau pranešime, tos visos nepasitenkinimas savo gyvenimu ir patiriami sunkumai ir tas troškimas sugriauti iš vis bet kokią įmanomą struktūrą ar sistemą ir yra vienas iš svarbiausių tų priežasčių, bet nelabai yra valios, kaip nors tą spręsti ar kažką su to daryti.
And I think in any phenomena we discuss, it's very important to understand that it's not something unique to a country. It's not that somehow Americans are uniquely evil, violence-prone, stupid, or dissatisfied. Pretty much any human being placed in those conditions of despair and inequality would sooner or later show such propensities.
Ir čia turbūt svarbu suprasti, kad nekalbam apie kažkokius konkrečių šalių ypatumus. Nėra amerikiečiai labiau už kitus linkę smurtauti, bet kuris žmogus atsidūręs tokioj desperatiškoj padėty, patirdamas tokią nelygybę ir visus panašius sunkumus, tikriausiai taip pat įgytų panašų polinkį.
In the same vein, it is important to be very careful when talking about people arriving from a broad variety of conflict zones in Europe.
Panašiai galima kalbėti ir apie, arba panašiai reikėtų atsargiai kalbėti apie žmonės atvykstančius į Europą iš įvairių konfliktų zonų.
I think it is something to admire that the continent and values that we hereby are still hotly debated as to whether they are defensible seem like a good prospect and a beacon of light to so many people still.
Man atrodo, galima žavėtis to, kad mes savo žemynę vis dar diskutuojam apie savo vertybės ir ar įmanoma jas apginti, bet žmonėms iš kitur jos vis dar atrodo labai patrauklios ir jos traukia čia.
And it is quite unfair to judge people who try to escape violent regimes of various denomination as if they were somehow tainted by those regimes themselves.
Ir nesąžininga smerkti bet kokio tikėjimo žmonių atvykstančių iš smurtinio režimo aplinkos, taip lyg jis būtų pats kažkaip užsiteršęs tuo režimu.
As I had mentioned, when we consider the level of democratization, economic development, or a variety of social cohesion parameters, Middle Eastern and Latin American countries quite often rank not so dissimilarly from our neighboring Belarus or Ukraine.
Kaip minėjau, jeigu lygintumėm demokratijos ir panašių vertybių parametrus, tai dažnai Lotynų Amerikos arba artimųjų rytų šalis atsiduria labai panašiam lygiai kaip Baltarusija ar Ukraina.
So I think the threat in Europe is not so much that those other people are going to arrive and do something to us.
Todėl manau, kad grėsmė Europoje yra ne tai, kad tie kitokie žmonės atkeliaus čia ir ką nors padarys mums.
It is much more concerning that what we consider to be us is shrinking locally, and that integration is failing on so many levels, the fractures being so prominent that even without the arrival of external parties, we are left in a tremendously insecure and anxious self-perception of the environment we live in.
Ir man atrodo, kad net ir neatvykus jokiems kitiems žmonėms, mes tarpusavyje taip susiskaldom ir taip sutraukiam savo saviškių supratimą, taip susiaurinam, kad net ir be jokios išorinės įtakos gyvenam taip subjektyviai suvokdami savo aplinką kaip labai grėsmingą.
Dar viena galimybė klausimams. Paskutinė galimybė paskutiniam klausimui.
Ačiū, Eglė, už labai įdomias mintis. Man kažkaip kilo mintis, vis pykstamės tarpusavį, sakydami žodį posovietinis palikimas. Vieni sako, nėra kitos išeities, reikia apie tai kalbėti, o kiti sako, baikit, kiek dešimtmečių praėjo. Tai aš turiu tyrimų ir pavyzdžių, vieną visai neseną, bet čia ne vieta man rodyti pavyzdžius. Man tiesiog įdomu, nes čia, gerai, trumpai pasakysiu, jūs paminėjot bendruomenę, man didžiulį įspūdį padarė visai nesenas tyrimas, mergina, jauna studentė, mūsiškė lietuvė, Olandijos vienam universitete iš architektūros darė magistro darbą ir susiejo su bendruomenė, gyvenamąją daugiabučio bendruomenę.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. And I'm thinking about how we are always struggling with this definition of post-Soviet here locally, because some people resist it and try to say that maybe enough talking about it, and others say we have no choice. This is something very prevalent in our life. And I have some research here, and an example of that is a young woman from Lithuania who did a study in Amsterdam, and she was studying the correlations of architecture and psychology, like living surroundings and how people feel in them.
Jinai kėlė paprastą klausimą. Vilniuje daroma tokių modernių kvartalų pagal danišką modelį su idėja, kad ir bendruomenės susikurs tuose naujuose gyvenamose vietose.
So she had this simple question, because in Vilnius recently some new blocks have been built following a Danish model with the idea that once you build sort of architecturally the space for it, the community will be created there.
Ir labai nustebusi atrado, kad pastatai tai yra, bet psichologiniam, socialiniam lygmenį nieks nevyksta. Jokių bendruomenių, žmonės nenori tų bendruomeniškumų.
And she was greatly surprised to discover that the buildings are there, but psychological processes aren't happening, and people just don't really want to be part of that community.
Ir jinai ieško paaiškinimų ir kelia, aišku, prielaidą, kad gal čia dar to sovietinio palikimo pasiekmes.
And she's looking for an explanation, and she raised a theory that maybe this is again part of the Soviet heritage.
Bet aš nenoriu jūsų kalbinti apie tą dalyką, kurio jūs nei matėt, nei skaitėt, bet jūsų kokia būtų pozicija. Ar galima tą diskursą tęsti toliau, ar jūs sakytumėt, kad reikia ieškoti naujų naratyvų ir su ta sovietinė jau baigti?
And I don't want to ask for your comments on something that you haven't maybe read or aren't familiar with, but just in general, how do you think, is it still worth talking about Soviet heritage and following that discourse, or maybe we should look for new narratives and new frameworks to discuss it?
Excellent question. I think in this specific study, I would be surprised if anywhere in the world the results were different, given the huge trend towards individualization and just lessening connections with external environment, everything going virtual.
Labai įdomus klausimas. Kalbant apie tą konkretų pavyzdį, tai aš bet kur pasaulyje nustebčiau, jeigu būtų išėję kaip nors kitaip, turint galvoj tokią individualizacijos tendenciją ir tai, kad žmonės iš vis mažiau užmezga ryšį su savo fizinė aplinka, nes vis daugiau ko nors vyksta virtualiai.
However, referring specifically to the Soviet period, my answer would be twofold.
Bet kalbant konkrečiai apie sovietų laikotarpį, aš atsakyčiau dvejopai.
On the one hand, I think in Lithuania, the narratives are predominantly shaped from the victim mentality perspective.
Viena vertus, Lietuvoje tie naratyvai yra visų pirma formuojami iš tokios aukos mentaliteto perspektyvos.
And that does not just concern the Soviet experience, that concerns the experiences during World War II, that concerns the Nazi war crimes, that concerns even the losses of the territorial losses following the disbanding of the Grand Duchy several centuries ago.
Ir taip kalbama net ne tik apie sovietų okupaciją, bet apie įvairias istorijos patirtis ir antrą pasaulinį karą ir nacių nusikaltimus, bet net ir apie didžiosios Lietuvos kunigaikštystės teritorinius praradimus prieš kelis šimtmečius.
It seems that a great number of people are very comfortable showing themselves as the permanent underdogs, punching above its weight, but yet constantly remembering, the difficulties, all the suffering, the suffering.
Ir atrodo, kad dideliai daliai žmonių labai patogu būti tokiais narsuoliais, išsišokėliais, tokiais zuikiais, drąsuoliais, bet tuo pačiu visą laiką prisiminti visas savo kančias ir visas savo vargus ir netektis.
So I think in that respect, just the way the narrative is framed, it is tremendously unhelpful. And post-Soviet anything, I would definitely say that enough is enough, but not specific, this lexicon, but more broadly, taking responsibility for our part in history, agreeing to see Lithuanians as aggressors, or at least as having sufficient agency in many of those situations. There's a high time for that.
Ir šia prasme aš sakyčiau, kad tas postsovietinis įvardymas daros nebenaudingas. Net ne tiek kalbos požiūriu, bet iš principo, kad laikas prisimti atsakomybę ir patikėti, kad lietuviai gali būti ir agresoriai, ir arba bent jau pripažinti, kad nuo mūsų irgi kažkas priklauso, kad mes irgi kažką sprendžiame.
But then comes the other hand. So the other hand is that this period, all that has unfolded between basically the 50s and the 90s is still a big black hole that we're only beginning to grapple with.
Bet yra ir kita vertus yra tai, kad visas tas laikotarpis nuo 6 iki 10 dešimtmečio vis dar tebėra tokia didžiulė juoda skylė ir mums dar labai daug ką jame reikia apdoroti ir apmastyti.
So when we're talking post-Soviet, it seems to refer to the present and that, the Soviet is something behind us and we're somehow dealing with the scars. So that approach is not something that I advocate.
Ir kai kalbam apie posovietinių, kai vartojam tokią savoką, kaip posovietinis laikotarpis, tai kalbam taip, lyg sovietmetis būtų jau praėjęs, paliktas praeitie, o mes čia dabar tik tvarkome su randais ir aš tokiam požiūriui nepritarčiau.
I mean, in fact, it has passed and we are in the present.
Tai yra iš tikrųjų laikotarpis praėjo ir mes gyvename dabartyje.
But it is very important to take a look back and start talking about things that unfolded, the complex phenomena, the social relations, the trauma, the art that has been created, a lot of the things that did not happen and were not created due to the circumstances that were there.
Bet vis tiek reikia atsigręžti į tą laikotarpį ir pradėti kalbėti ir apie sudėtingus reiškinius, ir apie socialinius ryšius, ir apie sukurtą meną tuo metu, ir taip pat apie dalykus, kurie neįvyko arba neatsirado dėl to, kad buvo sovietmetis.
But this analysis, it must be done on those temporal terms, that is not looking from the present to the past and seeing how it impacts us, doing a revision, but getting more comfortable in facing and meeting those phenomena on those contextual terms, not from today's perspective.
Bet tą reikėtų daryti ne vien iš dabarties perspektyvos ir svarstant apie tai, kaip tai mus veikia dabar, bet suprasti, apmastyti visus tuos dalykus jų pačių kontekste, koks buvo tada.
Lots of work to be done and lots of great people continuing to show willingness to engage. And I think only when we're comfortable there, when we can face the past on the past terms, can we be more comfortable in the present without there being a huge difference, however we choose to label it.
Labai daug darbo ir daug šaunių žmonių nori jo imtis ir manau, kad labai daug ir priklausys nuo to, kaip sugebėsime priimti praeitį tokią, kokia jinai buvo su jos pačios kontekstu.
Viskas. Ačiū.